right now. There, see that? And then the second thing, just to remind you, is please stay on mute, unless you're the speaker, obviously. There's going to be a fair number of people. There's already 46 of us, and I think there's going to be more coming. And because I think a lot of people are very excited to hear what Professor Ladson-Billings has to say to us tonight. But to get started, we're going to have our opening prayer, our opening reflection from Rabbi Dina Feingold. So, Rabbi Feingold.
Good evening, everybody. We come together this evening because we know that efforts to censor the truth are alive in the state of Wisconsin. And we know as people of faith that such censorship should not and cannot be tolerated. For the teaching of truth, no matter how painful, can only bring growth and healing to our children and to our communities. And that's what each of our religious traditions calls us to do. In Jewish tradition, remembering the past and learning from it is essential to our identity and our faith. The best known example of this is in the Passover Haggadah, the book we use at the Passover Seder, to teach our children and to remind ourselves of our past as an enslaved people and how we rose from slavery to be a people who then seeks the freedom of others who are oppressed and persecuted. In the Haggadah, we recite the words, even if all of us were wise, all of us understanding, all of us knowing the Torah, we would still be obligated to discuss the Exodus from Egypt, and everyone who discusses the Exodus at length is praiseworthy. Our tradition teaches us to reach back into our past, to delve deeply into it, and to take lessons from it. In the Exodus story, it's the Egyptians who do us wrong. We go back to that place where we were a subject people, the lowest of the low, and learn from it. But there are plenty of examples in the Torah and elsewhere in the Bible of times where our people were the ones doing wrong. We do not omit those stories from our scripture. We learn from those unsavory pieces of our past as well, and weave them into the tapestry of who we aspire to be and what we believe as Jews. Laws and policies that are now being proposed and adopted across the country to ban CRT, to ban books that teach America's history of slavery, discrimination, and xenophobia, are based on the misguided belief that children must have an eternally rosy picture painted for them in order to love their country. But telling the truth can never hurt American children. It can only build their compassion and patriotism and help them to become the kind of adults we want to lead us in the future. And so we pray in the words of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, from the cowardice that shrinks from new truth, from the laziness that is content with half-truths, from the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth, O God of truth, deliver us. And let us say, Amen.
Thank you so much, Dina. I really appreciate you being here tonight and opening with those really meaningful words. I'm Rabbi Bonnie Margulis, I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, one of the co-sponsors of Taking a Faithful Stand for Equity, and I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Gloria Ladson-Billings. Professor Ladson-Billings is Professor Emerita and former Kellner Family Distinguished Chair in the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's the past president of the National Academy of Education, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the British Academy, a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, a fellow of the Hagler Institute at Texas A&M University. She's the author or editor of 10 volumes and more than 150 articles and book chapters. She's received 9 honorary doctorates from national and international institutions. Professor Ladson-Billings is a nationally renowned expert on critical race theory and on how to teach in culturally diverse classrooms, with a particular eye to what makes teachers successful teaching African American students. She's the author of The Dreamkeepers, Successful Teachers of African American Children, and Crossing Over to Canaan, The Journey of New Teachers in Diverse Classrooms. I've heard Professor Ladson-Billings speak on this topic before, and she's an amazing teacher and expert, and I only wish that I could have a do-over and go back to school and take classes with her. Professor Ladson-Billings, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm going to turn it over to you, and I just want to let people know, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat, and we will share your questions with Professor Ladson-Billings after her presentation.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Bonnie. I'm so grateful to be here, and I thank you for the entire group, your leadership team, and folks who have taken the time to join in. I'm going to go straight to my slides because, as I'm very much like a professor, that I will ramble if I don't begin to have something, to be some guardrails for me and keep me on task. So let's see. All right, I hope you are seeing a screen that says debating the debatable. I always change up the topic title, but it's the same thing I said I was going to talk about. But the colon is, after the colon is understanding the CRT arguments. And I will tell you what I've always told my students the 27 years that I taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the 6 years that I taught at Santa Clara University in California. It's not my job to make you think like I think. It's my job to make sure you think. So I have no problem with people having counter perspectives, but let's just make sure we are being thoughtful about what perspectives we are taking. Rabbi Bonnie did a great job in telling you who I was in terms of that I'm Professor Emerita at UW-Madison. That's just a fancy way of saying that I am retired, but I am failing at retirement miserably. I'm the worst retiree ever, because I am indeed the past president of the National Academy of Education, which means I still sit on their board. I'm a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I'm just getting back from a meeting there in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm a fellow of the American Educational Research Association and also former president of the American Educational Research Association. I'm a fellow of the British Academy, and I will tell you, I don't even know what that means. I was inducted into the British Academy during COVID, so I haven't been there yet. But hopefully when I get back to, next time I get back to the UK, I will stop by the Academy and figure out what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm also a distinguished scholar of race and social justice. I just wrapped that up at Rutgers Graduate School of Education. And I want to suggest to you, I love this quote from comedian D.L. Hughley when he talks about what the heart of the problem is that we are dealing with. And he says, we will solve all the problems we don't have and do nothing about the ones we do. So getting kids to read a variety of books, that's not a problem. But somehow we decided we needed to solve that problem. And yet we have real problems that our young people are facing, that our society is facing. So I want to start by saying this is how the rest of the world, which I have put in quotes, discovered CRT. In September of 2020, Donald Trump made this statement. It, meaning CRT, is a toxic propaganda that will destroy our country. Now, I used to be a high school and middle school U.S. history teacher. So for me, context is everything. So if you look at that date, September 2020, you can remember what was going on at that time. We were in the middle of a presidential election. Donald Trump was standing for re-election, and his numbers were not looking good. What had happened with the COVID debacle, any number of other things that people were upset about, the sort of vitriol, the chanting to either build the wall or lock her up, had really so polarized the nation that he wasn't looking good as someone to be reelected. And I'm thinking that in some ways, this attack on CRT becomes a kind of a distraction. Don't look at what I'm doing over here, but let's worry about this. But where he got it from was a man by the name of Christopher Rufo, who I understand was just at the University of Michigan the other night speaking. And these are two direct quotes from Rufo. I'm very careful not to misquote folks. And Rufo said, these are from his Twitter feed, he says, the goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. Now, there's a lot in that statement because, number one, what's the something crazy? You know, he's making a judgment here. And then he says, the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. Well, Americans span the spectrum of ideas. So which are the ones that that are unpopular with them? His second tweet was, we have successfully frozen the brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all the various cultural insanities under that brand category. So again, what are the cultural insanities? And you can also see that this is a very strategic move. This isn't just coming off the top of Christopher Rufo's head. And if you dig a little deeper into his background, Christopher Rufo was is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which is a conservative think tank, but he's very well funded. And the same folks that fund him also fund a number of the book banning strategies. They also fund the Moms for Liberty, of which there are 275 chapters across the country, that also fund most of the anti-LGBTQ efforts. And so they seem like, quote, grassroots. It's also some of the same organizations that funded the Harvard case for school students for fair admission that ended up in dismantling affirmative action at the Supreme Court level. So it seems like these are separate and distinct entities, but often they are networked, well-funded, and have very big megaphones to be able to continue the conversation. So his notion of what the cultural insanities are, well, any discussions of race, any mention of racism, any questions of diversity, equity, inclusion, the term whiteness, I could have added privilege, any of that on there, social emotional learning, discussions of slavery, school segregation, almost any of these things that sort of are at the root of our understanding of ourselves as a very diverse nation are being prohibited because they're being placed under the banner of critical race theory. Most of them are not. In fact, for your information, the 1619 Project is not CRT, not at all. So I think it's interesting that we keep talking about something which we actually don't know what we're talking about. Where I learned of critical race theory is a book that was published in the late 1980s by Derek Bell, and We Are Not Saved, The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice. Bell was a masterful writer. He is one of the architects of critical race theory. It is a legal theory. And then I encountered the book by Patricia Williams, who was on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin Law School, The Alchemy of Race and Rights. And then what really got me interested in trying to see what the relationship between critical race theory and education might be is an article published in the Harvard Law Review, Race Reform and Retrenchment, Transformation and Legitimation of Anti-Discrimination Law by Kimberly Crenshaw. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this is that there is a through line. Bell, Williams, Crenshaw all have a Wisconsin connection. I often chuckle when I hear our legislators talk about CRT as something that came from some alien place, where Wisconsin was really the site of the very first CRT workshops. Most of the people who are instrumental in laying the foundation for critical race theory have come through Wisconsin, whether it is Richard Delgado, Dave Trubeck. I mean, there's just any number of legal scholars who first began to explore this notion right here in Wisconsin. My first article was published in 1995. So here we are, almost 30 years having this discussion about critical race theory going to destroy the nation. And I keep saying to folks, if it's about a revolution, this is the slowest revolution I've ever been a part of. Because when I started doing this work, I knew it was kind of ponderous and boring. It required me to spend long hours in the law library. And I thought, well, nobody's really going to read this. On the right hand, you see a picture of a book that I was asked to do this book, which is a compilation of articles that I had written on critical race theory over the last almost 30 years. When the editors came to me to write it, I didn't want to write it because I said, nobody's going to read this. This is boring. Well, it just hit at exactly the right time. So now it turns out I published this book. Donald Trump makes his pronouncements. Christopher Rufo has got everybody all ginned up. And now my haters have become my elevators because a book that I thought would never sell is doing pretty well. So then what is CRT? Those of us who work in this field have moved away from trying to constantly be in defensive mode. In fact, our motto now is define, not defend. We'll tell you what it is. Because every time I ask someone who is, quote, anti-CRT what it is, it's clear to me they don't know what it is. So it is a legal theory. You are seeing a copy of a book that was edited by Kimberly Crenshaw, Neil Gotanda, Gary Peller, and Kendall Thomas on the key writings that actually formed this movement. But it is also a theory that's been appropriated by other social sciences. So sociology now takes a look at it, psychology, education. And it's designed to explain racial inequality. That's its real purpose, to try to make sense of how a nation that is built on principles of democracy and liberty and justice still has so much racial asymmetry, so much racial inequality. So that's often a question that I will ask people. If people tell me, oh, I'm against CRT, my question is always, so how do you explain racial inequality? Now, if your response is there is no racial inequality, then we actually don't have a conversation because we live in parallel universes. But if you will admit that, yes, there exists racial inequality, whether it is in housing, employment, incarceration, in the criminal justice system, in education, what's your explanation for it? Now, let's be clear. We've always had explanations. From 1619, when the first Africans were pretty much documented as having come to this continent, to mid-20th century, we actually accepted biogenetic explanations for difference. I am reading a book by Malcolm Harris called Palo Alto, The History of California, Capitalism, and the World. It is fascinating. And just the discussion of how Stanford got started. Eugenics was at the heart of the Stanford experiment. You had to have 142, quote, IQ on the Stanford Binet to be admitted. And if you were a male, you needed to be 6'2". Now, I don't know what your height has to do with your intelligence, but that was this notion that certain people were better than other people. Many of our World's Fairs and exhibitions would have these exhibits where human beings would be there and they were ranked from the, quote, best, the so-called Aryans, to the worst, often some group of people from the continent of Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Somewhere around the mid-1950s, which is why I have this picture from the Brown decision, so it's 1954, we started saying things like, well, the inequality exists because people have unequal opportunity. That is actually a pretty good explanation for racial inequality, and it's certainly one that I bought into as a young scholar. The problem, however, is that every time that I found examples of opportunity being provided, I could see examples of where that opportunity got rolled back. So yes, Brown versus Board of Education is a landmark decision. In fact, my current dean, Diana Hess, at the School of Education, studies the Supreme Court. And some years ago, she had the opportunity to interview every Supreme Court justice. This is a Rehnquist court. And she asked the justices, of all the cases that young people have to study in government classes in our schools, which cases do you believe they must study? You know, all the major Supreme Court decisions, what cases do you believe they must study? There are two cases that every single justice agrees on, no matter whether they are seen as sort of traditionalists or originalists, like, folks like Alito or Thomas, or whether they are seen as more liberal, which at that time would have been Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Two cases. Number one, Marbury versus Madison. Well, that makes sense. That's about judicial review. But the other case that all 9 justices agree have to be taught is Brown versus Board of Education. Now, the irony of Brown versus Board for me is that Brown will be 70 years old as a decision next year. And yet our schools are more segregated than ever. So yes, it was an opportunity. It seemed to have rolled back. The Civil Rights Act has seemed to have rolled back. Affirmative action, we saw that go down this past spring. The Voter Rights Act. So in those states in which they were under the Voter Rights Act constraints, have now taken them all off. So they have limited the amount of access to voting. We have more so-called voter ID prohibitions. When I first moved to Wisconsin in 1991, what I loved about Wisconsin is that you just go in and vote. But now I have to go in and prove I am who I am because of some notion of widespread fraud. So unequal opportunity wasn't a strong enough explanation for me. But critical race theory claims that racial inequality is systemic. It isn't about just the individual person saying something bad to you or calling someone the N-word or making some anti-Semitic remark. It's the way the system is organized to support that kind of inequality. We also argue that it's permanent. Now, that part bothers people, and I can understand it, but it is so woven into our laws and policies, and I hope to be able to show you an example of that. So I'm kind of starting with a personal story here. So some weeks ago, a former student of mine who teaches social studies in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, asked his students to find out if anyone in their family benefited from the GI Bill. Most of the white students came back and reported that their grandparents had received funds for education, access to housing, and small business loans via the GI Bill. In fact, one of the students said that his grandfather, who did not have a high school education, started his broom business from a GI Bill sponsored small business loan. And this man eventually became a millionaire. And the student said, me, my siblings, and all of my cousins will all go to college because of that GI Bill, because my grandfather has made enough money to send us all to school. But none of the Black students could find a relative who had benefited from the GI Bill. Now, you might be saying, well, how can that be? It was, it was a national bill. Everybody should have been able to benefit. Well, what we do know is that Black GIs didn't receive the bill's benefit because many of the Southern congressmen pushed to make the administration of the bill a state responsibility. So think about, for example, the Affordable Care Act. Whether you have access to health care, even though it is it's a federal law, okay? The Affordable Care Act is passed. They've tried to repeal it. It's still in place. But in some states, some people are not getting access to health care because they didn't extend the Medicare provision of it. So here we are. GI Bill gets passed. Southern congressmen saying, no, let the state administer it. And most states had racial covenants restricting homes to whites only. So now I've got a GI Bill, but I can't purchase the house because there's a racial covenant in place. The Blacks who used the bill to enter, say, vocational and trade programs, maybe they didn't want to go to college, but like, I want to become a carpenter, I want to become a welder. They could get the training, but the trades programs didn't allow them to come into those fields. So the GI Bill ends up creating wealth among the white working class and contributed to the wealth gap that we are now continuing to experience in the Black community. I want to be a little more personal here and tell you that my dad was a World War II veteran. I love this picture of him because he's leaning on his favorite car. For those of you who couldn't recognize, that's a 1956 Plymouth Savoy that had the push button gears. That was a pretty cool car back in those days. But yeah, my dad was a World War II veteran. He did what he needed to do on behalf of this country. But there's a tale of two homes to be shared here. On the left is a reasonable facsimile of the home in the community that I grew up in. On the right are the Levittown homes that were going up in the 1950s. Brand new homes. My dad was approved for a GI Bill loan, housing loan, a VA loan for $8,000. Yes, there used to be homes that cost $8,000. The home that he bought in West Philadelphia cost $8,000. But guess what? The brand new Levittown house cost $8,000. So why didn't we go to Levittown? Well, because Levittown had something called Clause 25 in its standard lease that said the following: the home could not be used or occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race. And I have this picture on the right that shows you how extensive Levittown was. We're talking almost 30,000 homes in which there is no person other than a white person living in it. And Levittown wasn't just outside of Philadelphia. There are Levittowns outside of New York City. There are Levittowns in the outside of Baltimore. There are Levittowns outside of Cleveland. So there are tens of thousands of homes with that standard clause in its lease that essentially says only white people can live here. Now, if you ask me, did I like living where I lived? Did I like my neighborhood? I absolutely did. The fact that I went to a segregated elementary school didn't bother me one bit. The fact that most of my teachers were Black, I loved it. So you might be saying, so what's your beef? Well, I did a little bit of research and I found out that the home that my parents bought, according to Zillow, is now worth about $93,000. The Levitt home in that area is worth $565,000. So the ability to transfer wealth was not available to my father. He had nothing to hand down to my brother and I. But our peers out in Levittown were going to inherit a lot more because of the equity and the property values that they had access to. This is not about an individual GI saying something bad to my dad. This is not about somebody calling my dad the N-word or holding up a noose. This is about an entire system. And why would I say it's an entire system? Because we knew that Jacob Levitt couldn't afford to build all those houses by the money he had. The federal government is subsidizing this fact that he doesn't want anybody in the house that isn't white. Closer to home, of course, we know that in Chicago, that lots of people ended up buying contract homes. They thought they were buying homes, but they never gained ownership. Somewhere between 75% and 95% of homes sold to Black families in Chicago during the 50s and 60s were sold on contract. And the price markup on those homes was 84%. African Americans who bought on contract paid on average an additional $587 in current dollars more a month than if they had been able to get a conventional mortgage. Again, it's not about individuals doing, negative things to them. It's about a system that allows that to happen. So what then are the tenets of this thing called CRT? Well, it is the belief that racism is normal. It's not aberrant in the United States, that people who are seen as outside of the circle of humanity should expect to experience some form of racism. That there's something known as interest convergence, which I'll get into, that race indeed is a social construction, but it has material consequences. There is something about intersectionality and anti-essentialism, and I'm going through this fast because I'm going to go back to each of these specifically, and the importance of voice or counter-narrative. The notion that racism as normal is one that is kind of a joke to most Americans. Gunnar Myrdal, the famous Swedish sociologist who wrote the book, the classic book, American Dilemma, essentially said, well, yeah, there's racism in the US, but it's kind of an anomaly. It's not sort of the driving force. But later, Jennifer Holshaw debunked that and said, no, the way that democracy developed in the US and racism developed is kind of symbiotic. They grew together. They fed off of each other. So the idea here is that you should expect to encounter racism in the society. The notion of interest convergence is one that Derek Bell proposed, and he said that typically white people will seek racial justice only to the extent that there's something in it for them. So if you look, for example, at the way in which the affirmative action law, originally Lyndon Johnson said it was for undeserved, disenfranchised folks of color. Within a year, he had to change it and make it and women. Okay, yes, we could see how women were being disadvantaged, but by the time we get to sort of full-blown use of affirmative action, the major beneficiaries are white women because there are more of them. However, as I often say to my students, that there is no place that I know of known as White Woman Island. They don't live off somewhere else. They live in communities, mostly with other white people. So I don't imagine that a woman who got a job because of affirmative action comes home and has her partner say, hey, we don't want that affirmative action money. No, that money flows into that household income. It pays the mortgage, it pays the bills, it helps pay for whatever disposable income the family has. So this is the interest convergence, that you're able to do something on behalf of folks of color only when white folks also see, well, what do we get out of this? The notion that race is a social construction, I love this point by anthropologist Audrey Smedley, who says there's a deep paradox between the scientific notion of no race. In other words, scientists will tell you you cannot tell what the race of people is just by looking in the microscope at a cell, right? But there's this paradox between this notion of no race and the social parameters of race by which we conduct our lives and structure our institutions. In other words, even though race is a social construction, it's not scientifically valid as a concept. There's only one race. It is a human race. We've made all of our social institutions and all of the ways in which we operate in a society determined by racially determined. The notion of intersectionality and anti-essentialism is that we're never just looking at one thing. The examination of race, sex, class, national origin, sexual orientation, and how their combinations play out in different settings. You know, what does it mean to be someone who is both race and class and gender? It's the question I often ask myself when I feel some sort of notions of being excluded or discriminated against. I'm always saying, are they doing this because of my race? Is it because I'm a working class person? Is it because I'm a woman? All of those things kind of come together. So it's never just one thing. And then, of course, the notion of voice or counter narrative. Now, some people in the scholarly community will say things like, oh, well, you're just telling stories. Yeah, we are telling stories because that's what human beings do. We all tell a story. If you've ever spent any time in a courtroom, there's two stories being told. Same evidence, two stories. And I love this African proverb that says, until lions have their historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter. So who gets to tell a story? Critical race theory is really that speaking back to what might be thought of as the master narrative. So, of course, my question is about how all of this applies to educational inequalities. That's the pool in which I swim. So I often will ask school folks, whether they are teachers or administrators or school board members, how do you explain academic disparities? How do you explain underrepresentation in advanced and honors classes? How do you explain overrepresentation in subjective special education placement? How do you explain overrepresentation in suspension and expulsion? And it's every city and community in which I've gone, I've seen these asymmetries between groups. And so finally, I will always say, why do all the differences align with race? Those are questions that I think we have to begin to ask ourselves. Finally, I just want to point out that CRT is not sexy. It's not the, cool thing. It's not trendy. It's not new. We've been working on this theoretically for over 30 years, close to 40 years now. It's also not racial navel gazing. It is not just, oh, you're just so consumed with race. No, we're trying to understand how the inequality, how do we get like this so that we can move past it? And it's not taught in K-12 classrooms because I just don't know that many teachers who have spent enough time in a law library to actually read and understand the case law upon which it is built. So I hope I haven't gone too fast, but I want to make sure that we get to the notion of questions, and I'm going to come out of sharing this. And hopefully we can have a pretty robust discussion.
That was wonderful. Thank you. If we have questions or comments, can people please put them in the chat? So while we wait to see what people are typing, I don't know how fast people can type. So I'm wondering what your understanding is of the moment that we're in. What is it that has impelled people today to go to school board meetings and demand that books be banned and demand that curricula be changed. And what's really floored me in the last few years is how unabashed people are at saying, I don't believe in equity.
Well, let's be clear. Book banning has a very long history in the United States. We banned our first book in 1685 because this man wrote a book that went against Puritan orthodoxy, and they put him in jail for it. What's different now is that, and it's always been certain groups, right? So you often will have a religious group who finds a book offensive and they will lobby against it. Usually, the issues are typically around sex. To Kill a Mockingbird was one of the most banned books in this country. So, so it isn't a new thing. What is new is that the state is now engaged in this. I would never say that an individual or a group of individuals don't have the right to petition the school board and say, we don't like that book or we don't want, that's their right. But when it turns out that the state is engaged in this to me is tyrannical. We have had 2,200 books banned this year alone. Texas is leading the pack with them, followed by Florida. To me, and what's interesting is it comes under this banner of parental rights. To me, you have a right to say, I don't want my kid to read that book. I don't have a right to say, I don't want anybody's kid to read the book. And it's what's happening right now. So I don't, part of it is that the playbook is very similar. 30 of our 50 states have some sort of bans around books and also teaching CRT, even though they don't actually know what CRT is. And I think that we've fallen into such a polarized nation that we can't have conversations with people who disagree with us. That, to me, is very dangerous for democracy. Democracy relies on deliberative discussion. That's how we got a constitution, because people were willing to sit down and have the conversations. We are now either not talking to each other at all, or we are talking past each other. And most of us are existing in echo chambers. We only talk to people who think and believe the way we do. I would say in the last 15 years, one of the changes that I made in my courses, and I teach courses around diversity, is to really begin to speak about religion as one of the diversities that we experience. I think, there's people have this prohibition, we can't talk about religion. No, you can't proselytize, okay? You can't try to convert people. But without a discussion of religion, American history is incoherent. You cannot understand how do you get people who will kill each other in the Civil War without understanding the role that religion plays. Both sides believing, we're in a holy war. So, but it's important to have that conversation. It's important to be in spaces where deliberative conversations and discussions go on. What I am seeing on college campuses right now is frightening to me. And we have certain speakers who say they're not coming to college campuses anymore because the space for conversation keeps shrinking.
That is frightening. So we've had some comments and some questions in the chat. I do want to remind people, because several people have commented that there's so much information and they're still working on absorbing it all. So I do want to remind people that this presentation has been recorded and we'll be putting it up on YouTube. Somebody asked, I like this question because it's very basic. but goes to the heart of the question. What is the big fear that people of color will take over? I don't get it, says the comment.
Well, I think the term xenophobia applies here. That is fear of anything different. And the U.S. has a long history of this, because I have the privilege of teaching very young people. I recognize that a lot of the way that they absorb information is visually. So in addition to having them read, I also have them view. I have them look at films. One of the films that I have the students look at is The Gangs of New York. And the question for them is, why are these people fighting each other? Don't they kind of look a lot alike, don't they? Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio, whoever this other, what's the difference, right? And that's where I help them understand race has been socially constructed. That at this moment, the Irish are, quote, not white. So the way that we have made and remade these categories keep placing us in a situation where we have decided these are the people who are in the circle of humanity, and all these other people are outside of that circle. Almost every major war that we have seen, we've seen the creation of the other. I know we often mark World War II because it was just so horrific, but I'm struck by the Rwandan War, where they create a category. There were no Hutsis or Tutsis before the British created them. And now all of a sudden, people who used to live next door to each other are killing each other. That challenge of humanity, I think, to recognize the humanity in the person who is not at all like me, that's the hard work.
Thank you. The question is asked, how do you counter the narrative that children will be harmed by learning about inequity and its origins?
That's hard work. I mean, I'm actually someone who would say, I never met a book that kills somebody, and we're in a society that we're overrun with guns. Our children have been shot down, gunned down in schools. It wasn't a book that killed those children at Sandy Hook or Marguerite Stoneham High School or Uvalde. It's back to the D.L. Hughley quote that I started with, is that we'll try to solve the problems we don't have while leaving the problems we do have untouched. And, the fact that our kids are dying in schools, if that doesn't get us revved up, I don't know what's going to move us to a place where we say enough.
Can you speak to using CRT to eliminate any and everything related to DEI?
This is like, I don't know. I grew up in Philly, so I'm used to people always doing kinds of sleight of hand things on the street. You could lose your money in 10 minutes in Philadelphia. So it's a game called the 3-card Molly, right? Where you're moving around the card and you're betting which card has the ace or whatever. That kind of sleight of hand is what has happened with DEI. DEI didn't have anything to do with CRT. In fact, most people who do CRT says, in some ways, DEI is kind of a way to appease folks and try to be soft and kind and not hard hitting. But someone already didn't like the notion of DEI. And then, so again, the Rufo strategy is very clear. Let's just put everything under that category. So we won't run out here and say, quote, diversity. We'll run out here and say CRT, but now it includes diversity. I both fortunately and unfortunately spend part of the year in Florida. Fortunately, because between December and April, it feels a lot better. But unfortunately, because I have to listen to just the ranting around that's coming out of the governor's office. Part of what people don't understand is that the law that got passed, the so-called anti-woke legislation, and can I say, as someone who also taught English, the opposite of woke is sleep. Just so you know, I don't think it's that complicated. But the anti-woke legislation, HB 7 in the state of Florida, will makes the teaching of certain ideas, concepts, books, a class 3 felony. So it's not just a misdemeanor if a teacher is accused of this. This is a felony. If you are convicted of that felony, you will never teach again. Because even if you decide, okay, I'm gonna leave Florida, I'm gonna come back to Wisconsin and I'll teach here, you still have to fill out the application. And there is a question that says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And yes, now you have, and you will likely not be able to teach. So the climate, which has been ginned up by what we have seen over the last 7 years. I think one of the narratives we like to tell ourselves as Americans is that America is this sort of steady stream of progress. I think that is actually not true. That America is more a pendulum. We go one way and we swing back the other way. So that when Barack Obama was elected, yes, people had high hopes. But me, as well as a lot of my colleagues, had great fear. We said, watch the backlash. It did not take the Tea Party 2 months to get organized. So we're always going to be in that push-pull tension between sort of a progressive agenda versus one that is much more. And I don't have anything wrong with someone taking a conservative stance, but really pushing towards almost reactionary. And I think it's important for us to understand that this is not local. This is not just about the Wisconsin State House. This is not just about the United States. You are seeing a rightist turn across the world. I have seen it in the UK. Marie Le Pen shows up for every French election and gets more votes each time. Even in my beloved Sweden, and you have to know me to know why I love Sweden, but I spent a lot of time there at research. But even there, you are starting to see a backlash against immigration in Sweden that wasn't there before. So when I say we have to be on guard against sort of anti-diversity, anti-equity, anti-justice kinds of movements, it's not just in the US.
Exactly. So I know that you had some suggestions for actions that people should take.
I did. So I want people to remember 3 E's: educate, experience, and expand. First and foremost, we have to educate ourselves. We have to continue to read and know more about what's going on. What we are seeing across the country on college campuses, I have a dear friend who works at the National Academy and who happens to be Jewish, and her son is just terrible. He's at Cornell. He's scared to go outside. So, but the problem is not that people choose a quote side, but they're not educated about it. They are reacting to images and misinformation. That's one of the downsides of social media, is that, anything can just sort of show up in your mailbox and on your cell phone. So we've got to educate ourselves. We need to be doing reading about these issues that we claim to care about. I know we want to do something because we're Americans. Americans love doing stuff, right? Americans are the only people in the world. You say, oh, you want to go to Paris this summer? What do we say? No, we did Paris. No, you don't do it, okay? We need to stop doing stuff and learn to educate ourselves about stuff. Just learning to read. Like I think I mentioned Malcolm Harris's book, Palo Alto. I'm so fascinated with it because I spent almost 20 years in that community and I had no idea. For example, that the computers that we all love and are using right now were never, ever the intent of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley's intent, and even though they have a wonderful little narrative about 2 guys in the garage, Hewlett and Packard, right? Was always about defense. It was about weaponry. It was about war. The computers are just the ancillary benefit that came out of that. So we have to educate ourselves. Secondly, we need experiences outside of our own comfort zone. We need to go to fora, go to sessions. You know, one of the things that I used to have my students do was an activity called the Madison the Campus Never Sees. Because I was convinced that if all they did was operate between Henry Street and Hilldale, they didn't have a real understanding of what was happening in this city. They didn't know, for example, that Madison Metropolitan School District is about 52% students of color. Totally different from the makeup of the campus. So I make them go places, and some of the places I make them go are to religious institutions. I make them go to churches, I make them go to mosques, I make them go to synagogues and temples. Just go see. I make them go to a Catholic service that only services Latinx folks. And it's packed. You know, it's like 500 people in there, all speaking Spanish. You wouldn't know that if all you do is stay on campus. Not understanding that, you know, there are several mosques that many of them serving African Muslims as opposed to Arab Muslims. So it's really important that we have some experiences beyond what we typically would have. And then finally, I ask people to expand, and that is expand their circle of friends. The tendency for many of us who have had enough privilege to go to college and have really good jobs is to think that the expansion that we're going to do is helping those poor people, those poor kids. I really force my students to try to develop an equal status relationship. Don't think about going to Allied Drive and helping those kids. Don't, you know, think about going to Vera Court. Find a college student from a different background than yours and just go to coffee with them and hear their story. How did they get there? I think I gave you an example of people. I asked people to imagine their own funeral. And despite how morbid that might sound, what I asked you to think about is, who you think is going to show up? I've been to a number of funerals where my husband and I are the only Black people at the funeral. And I'm thinking, okay, you done lived 87 years and you only know 2 Black people? Trust me, when I go, white people are going to come to my funeral, if only to see, oh, is she really dead? Okay. But I just, you know, I think we just stay in these little narrow environments. I had the pleasure and the unique experience of growing up, yes, in a segregated neighborhood for elementary school, but by junior high school and high school, I was going across town. I went to the largest high school in the state of Pennsylvania, 4,500 kids. About half of them were Black, and the other half were Jewish. Not just white, they were Jewish, because nobody would call themselves white back then. They said, no, they said, we're Jewish, right? And so now have I been to bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, I've been to seders, I've been gone and set shiva with people. I know what certain experiences are. You know, when someone says that someone Jewish had passed away and they say, oh, well, when do you think they're going to have their funeral? I said, in the next 24 hours. What do you mean? Because that's part of a tradition. And if you don't know that, you know, you tend not to be able to see, where is the humanity? Where are the commonalities? I don't know any group that doesn't have as a part of their culture some ritual of insult. It's just some way that it's a way to talk bad about you in that culture, right? But if you don't extend yourself, you look at what people do and think, oh, it's strange. Why are they doing that? We just really need to start there, as opposed to thinking, oh, our first job is just to be activists. No, we do have to educate ourselves. We do have to have more experiences, and we have to expand our circles.
Well, thank you so much. This has certainly been an education and an experience for all of us. And I so appreciate your taking the time to be with us tonight and allowing us to record which is wonderful. And we just really appreciate you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure is mine.
So I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Lisa Jones from MICAH, to close us out. And then Lisa will introduce our closing prayer.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you, Professor. That was just so enlightening, just to hear and all of the things that you have taught us, and you have given us. I'm gonna be really honest. You have, with those 3 E's, we have our marching orders. We have our marching orders. So we got the 3 E's to go do it on all the spaces of what we can do. And so here is a faith-based groups that are sponsoring this, and how that ties to our advocacy. So we educate in our circles, you know, the experience, and then of course we need to make sure that people are living out the justice values in the public arena. So that means for us, we have our marching orders that we want to make sure that what are people and our children learning in our schools? Do you know? Do you know what's going to be happening around Black History Month? Are they just going to just do the Dr. King and just do the I Have a Dream speech, woohoo, and just the last 2 minutes of the speech? Or and then that get involved in what is happening in your own community. You can't leave it to somebody else, because if you leave it to somebody else, look, it may not get done. Because right now we are in a time now where whoever screams the loudest and makes the biggest noise at the school board gets on the news, and it becomes policy. And your children and your grandchildren are being excluded from learning things that is painful history. Of course, it is painful, but that's still history. We can't get beyond that. And so we have our marching orders of what needs to happen. And so be the change you want to see in your own community, in your own circles. Be the whatever your faith tradition, but from mine, I'm thinking of the Old Testament prophets. They went out and they did the work, even in the midst of hardships, and when it was not difficult, and even they didn't care about being liked. So we have to be able to live out our faith traditions in the public arena, however hard it is, because this is about what is good and right. And this is about creating beloved community, a permanent beloved community. And so, my friends, we can all be prophets in our own circles. You can join that, just like the professor has given us all the things. So I'm going to turn over our closing prayer to
Lisa, if I can just interrupt for just a second before the closing prayer, we have just a few announcements.
Oh yes, remind me of the announcements.
So we wanted to let folks know that we have a resource list of sort of anti-racism materials, books, videos, organizations you can join or donate to or volunteer with, podcasts to listen to, all kinds of things. So we will be sending that out with the link to the recording from tonight. And we want to let you all know that because of the December holidays, we're going to take a break in December, but we will come back for our regular monthly webinars. Our first one will be January 9th, and David O'Connor from DPI will be speaking about Native American instruction in our public schools. You all may remember that he was supposed to speak earlier this year, and and unfortunately was ill. So we rescheduled that for our January 9th webinar, and we'll look forward to seeing you all then. So thank you, Lisa, for letting me interrupt.
That's okay. That's okay. And thank you for the reminders of everything that's going on with my health. And I just wanted to turn it over to one of our clergy leaders in MICAH, whose congregation has been very actively involved in things, and so she will give our closing prayer from her own tradition from Universalist Unitarian. And Pastor Julie, you are on to do our closing prayer.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Professor Ladson-Billings. I'm sorry I had to come in late. I feel like I missed a whole lot, but I got some great stuff at the end, and I appreciate being able to be included and to listen in tonight. I think you're so right that this is nothing new, and there's so much to learn from history and from the many ways these similar kind of actions and efforts have been apparent in the past. In my tradition, we turn to the wisdom of others. And when Lisa asked if I would offer the closing prayer, I thought about the book that came out now 25 years ago, Prayers for 1,000 Years, which was the prayers for the millennium, the turn of the millennium. And there is a section in there about for the children and the prayers for the children. And they are so poignant now 25 years later. At this time, in so many ways, the children in our schools, children in our communities, the children in Palestine and Israel, children in Hungary. So much to think about in terms of what we do for the children. So I really appreciate this call to educate ourselves and to become aware of our role. So I just ask you all to turn your hearts and spirits to the ways in which that you pray, the prayerful attitude that you take when you enter into a time of prayer and meditation. And I just want to share a couple of different sets of words. The first is from Joanna Macy, who writes a prayer to the beings of the future. And she wrote, in the spiral ribbons of our cells, you are here. In our rage for the burning forest, the poison fields, the oil-drowned seals, you are here. You beat in our hearts through late-night meetings. You accompany us to clear cuts and toxic dumps, and halls of the lawmakers and school board meetings. It is you who drive our dogged labors to save what is left. Oh, you who come after, help us remember we are your ancestors. So fill us with gladness for the work that must be done. And then a few words of inspiration from Stephen Foster, who at the time was the co-director of the School of Lost Borders. Another writing about being elders, taking our place for the future. He wrote, everywhere true elders will appear within the human community. Neighborhood by neighborhood, they will build bridges across the chasms of ignorance and intolerance that separate us. Thus, they will take their rightful place among the young and once again define the terms of the passage into adulthood. The children will be given a way to reach adulthood, and the spirit of nature will be enriched by a fully human maturity. The ancient dreams of those who have gone before will be empowered in the councils with such visionary insight that the people will survive. So be it.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you again to Professor Ladson-Billings for being with us tonight and sharing her wisdom and to Rabbi Feingold for opening us up with her words of wisdom. Thank you all so much. I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving and whatever winter holidays you might be celebrating, and we will see you again in January. Look for the email with the link to tonight's recording and to other information and to the link to register in January. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
All right, goodbye.